Hello everyone, Jackie Edwards here. Thank you so much for joining me today. So today I want to talk about financing for your rent-to-rent deals. Now this is a topic that comes up super often, and I know rent-to-rent is touted as like, you don't need a lot of money to get started. Some people even say you don't need any money to get started. I disagree with that. I think you definitely do need some money. Um, Whether that's your money or, somebody else's money, that's up to you. So I think on average, for a rent to rent deal, you're looking at about £5,000 to like get that specific deal up and running. Ahead of that, you're also going to have your startup costs for your business. So you're starting a business just like anybody else, anywhere in the world, starting any other kind of business. Generally, you need some money to do maybe some legal work. You're going to need to do some advertising, just bits and pieces. There's a couple of registrations that you need to have. You can see videos on that and on the rest of my site. So you will need money to get started. Now, if you have no money, you need to start getting out there and networking, because the number one way of really having continuous stream of finance for your deals is through networking and building joint venture partners. Now, you can also, use all the traditional ways of raising finance. I don't, it will really depend on your personal situation. The first thing I want to say about finance, and first of all, I am not giving you any kind of financial advice. This is all for educational purposes only. You have to look at your own personal situation. Now, before you borrow money, you need to understand how you're going to pay that money back. Now, if you don't already have a deal lined up, it can be a little trickier because you don't know exactly how you're going to pay that money back. Now, of course, you could say, yes, I'm going to be able to get a deal. I'm going to do the work that's necessary. And for some people, having that extra boost, so having that, I've borrowed money from somebody, now I really need to make it work, gives you that extra boost to make it happen and actually build your business. So be very careful anytime you're raising finance or borrowing money. There's my little caveat to caution. Um, how best to borrow money? I raised money for my deals through credit card loans. Now, again, this is a very controversial one. You need to be very careful. Now, I am lucky and I've always had a very high credit score. I've been using credit cards since I was 18. Like, I had some problems with some credit card debt back in the day. I will admit that. But I always paid my minimum balance off. So since I've been using credit cards for that long, both in the US and the UK, I do have a really good credit score, which means I can borrow money from my credit cards very cheaply. So I think initially I was borrowing from my credit card um, for like 4% interest. And that was over the lifetime of the loan. So sometimes they were giving, so it's kind of like the cash advance deals that your credit cards will give you. Sometimes those were for like 3 or 4 years for 4% for that entire time period. Now that is super cheap lending. Now, you have to be really careful that you have a plan of how you're going to pay that money back, because if it got to the end of that 3 or 4 years, you haven't paid that money back, that kind of introductory rate goes away and now you're paying 20, 30, 40% interest on that money. So you have to be very careful and really understand what you're doing when you're using credit cards. I think that going to joint venture partners is a bit more of a safe route. It can take a little bit longer because you have to build those relationships up. Now, you might be able to go to friends and family and they're happy to work with you straight away. And, you've already got that relationship. You've already, got the credibility with them and they're happy to help you out. And if that's the case, that's awesome. If that's not the case, even with my family, I had to go out and prove myself before, my parents were interested in investing in my business. They thought this was honestly, my family, my dad especially, was just super disappointed that I was no longer going to be an accountant. He thought that being an accountant was the greatest thing ever and I was so prestigious and I worked for one of the biggest firms ever and blah. So when I told him I wasn't going to do that anymore, he was heartbroken. He wasn't ready to invest in any new venture that I was all of a sudden coming up with. So it took him at least a year before he really understood what I was doing and I had the proof of concept behind me. So if your friends and family aren't interested right now, don't worry. They might be in the future. But in this time, now you have to get out and network. So It's almost just as important as getting out and viewing properties. You need to be getting out and going to networking meetings, whether that's property networking meetings or just general business networking meetings or whatever kind of networking meetings and events you can find. That's where you need to be going. And you need to be spending time with people and not just pushing your business card on them and saying, blah, 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 blah. Here's what I do. Here's what I do. Here's what I do. And just talking at them. You need to be understanding what does that person want? What are they interested in? How can you help them? And build that relationship up and see, because you might not be saying you are going to invest in me. You want to say, who do you know who might want to invest in property? It might want to invest in my property business. So build that relationship up so that they know, like, and trust you and open their networks to you. All right. So what do you do once they've given you some money? How do you structure it, I guess, is probably the biggest question that I get asked. Because we all see these things on property forums and your property training courses of 50-50 profit shares and 12% interest and all that kind of stuff. I suggest you keep it super, super, super simple, especially in the beginning when you're just building up that kind of relationship with somebody. If you start doing a profit share, you have to open up your books to that other person so that they're able to see what your profit actually is. You have to be very, very specific on what profit is. Are you going to be able to deduct any of your costs, any of your expenses? What expenses? Are you going to deduct your time? Who's going to do what? It gets a lot more complicated. And then there's a lot more room for disagreements, for just problems down the line, especially if you've never worked together before. You won't know how the other one kind of deals with situations, deals with stress, who's doing what, all of that type of thing. So I suggest in the beginning, so if you find somebody that's ready to work with you and maybe they want to do a profit share and they want to do 50-50 or 40-60 or whatever kind of split, I would suggest starting with a simple loan agreement. So say something like, let's get to know each other first and make sure that we really enjoy working together. So how I like to structure that is initially I like to work on a simple loan basis. So you would lend me, £5,000. I will pay, 5% interest, which right now is a lot higher than you're going to get anywhere else. I mean, the banks are at like 0% interest. Anyways, I'll pay you 5% interest per annum. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's as simple as that. You can structure your monthly payments. So the key thing to remember here is that you won't be able to sell this property or remortgage it at the end to pay the investor back. So you'll just have to make your calculations so that you're paying capital and interest every single month. So by the end of your rent-to-rent deal, you've paid that investor off completely. So that is the absolute simplest way of doing things. That way you don't have to open your books to that investor. You don't have to prove what's profit, what's not profit. Are your costs reasonable? Are you making sure you're not marking things up and keeping money for yourself? It just helps to avoid any issues that might come up where you guys have disagreements on how things are being accounted for. So once you've done that maybe a couple of times and you enjoy working together, you've got similar values, similar ways of working, then maybe you can look at doing kind of joint ventures where you're properly doing profit sharing and more complicated things. But I would steer clear of that. Also, make sure your interest rates aren't too high. I know a lot of people in the property world do talk about quite high interest rates for borrowing and lending money. Oftentimes it's 12%, which makes it an easy 1% per month. But that's too high for most people. When you start getting too high, like even 5% right now is going to start looking a little dodgy to people because nowhere else you can get that interest rate. And they're thinking, oh, it's too good to be true. You're doing something dodgy. I don't want to get involved in this. So you want to keep your interest rates low and reasonable for kind of the common average people because they're not used to, new ways of thinking and new ways of business and looking at things this way. So I was able to get joint venture partner money at 5 and at 6%. We paid 6% to family just because family. But otherwise 5% I probably could have gotten away with 4% in some cases. So really make sure you're looking at that. Make sure you're keeping this as simple as possible. If you start having questions about how to structure things, it's getting too complicated. Keep it simple. You can get simple loan agreements from online, I mean, Google simple loan agreement. There's loads of legal websites that can give you a simple loan contract. Because with rent to rent, your loan amounts are not super high. So generally, I would say you're probably loaning or borrowing, there's a word, borrowing like £5,000 maybe from somebody. Maximum, I'd say £10,000, probably a lot less. You don't need to worry about your contracts being too onerous, basically. You don't need to go over the top. You don't need to have a solicitor involved. There's no security on anything. Just keep it simple. Super, 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 super simple. Make sure the contract is easy enough for both parties to read and to understand without needing a solicitor involved, without needing, a university education. Keep it simple. Simple interest rates, simple monthly payments. I even use a simple interest calculation. So instead of like daily interest calculations and different interest every month, blah, 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 I just use simple interest. If you don't know what that is, again, Google it. Keep it as simple as possible. If you've got questions, you're probably not making it simple enough. All right, so that is what I wanted to share with you. That is probably my biggest tip ever for getting joint venture money. And especially if you're going to somebody, it's a lot easier to say, here's how I structure it. You lend me £5,000, I pay 5% interest per annum. It's going to take, we pay every month on the first of the month. Job done. Whereas if you start talking to somebody and you're building this relationship and you're like, oh, we can structure it any way you want, and then you're putting too much pressure on them. Then they've got to start thinking about how do they want it to be structured? What are they looking for? And then they're like, but don't you know? I mean, isn't this your business? Shouldn't you know how your loans are structured and what kind of deals to put through? And it's just gets too complicated for them. They're going to be like, look, it's too hard. I'll just go put my money somewhere where somebody else has already got a contract and it's way easier and I don't have to put this much thought and effort into it. You want to make it as easy as possible for that other person to give you their money. So keep it simple. Build relationships. So in order for somebody to give you their money, you need to have that relationship built. So get out there, build relationships, and have a lovely renting time. I will see you in the next video.